Okay, we're going to start with the book of Genesis. Book of Genesis has 50 chapters. A lot of information starts with creation. And the creation in the Bible we date till about 4000 BC, before Christ. That means about 6,000 years ago, because 0 is Christ's birth, and now we're 2022. So it's about 2,000 years, and 4,000 BC would have been 4,000 before Christ. Added up, it's about 6,000. And how they came up with that number is basically that in the Bible, starting in Genesis, it lists all the generations from Adam to Christ's birth. And it lists the ages of most of the people that lived, which was up to about 970 years old, some of them in the Old Testament. And then it was kind of capped at 120 years old, which is still the cap today. But anyways, you add all that up and you get to, and because it also lists the age of how old they were when they gave birth to the next son, who eventually ended up in the lineage to Christ. So, but Moses is the one to have written the first 5 books in the Bible, which is also called 5 books of Moses, or the Torah, which is the law in Hebrew. And almost the whole Old Testament was written in Hebrew, which is the official language of the Jewish people. Now, they spoke Aramaic, the Jewish people. They spoke Aramaic, but the official language, political, economical language was Hebrew. There are 2 books in the Old Testament that were written in Aramaic, Daniel and Ezra, but everything else was written in Hebrew. In Greek, it's called the Pentateuch, which is called the 5 scrolls, the first 5 books of the Bible, but it was written in Hebrew, called Torah, which is also how the Jewish people refer to it, the Torah. So creation about 4000 BC, written by Moses, who lived about 1450 BC, so about 2,500 years after creation. And so it was passed down verbally through generations of the Jewish people, all the things that happened up till when Moses was alive, but he is the one who documented it. And so the Bible starts with the book of Genesis in the Garden of Eden, and it's located somewhere East Africa / Saudi Arabia. And what's interesting about it, it mentions a couple of rivers that are still there today, and also the genealogy project, something like that, that was performed by National Geographic's 20-some years ago. It was basically like Ancestry.com, like you would use your saliva and send it in, and then you could go on a website and they would show you where you came from, if you're England or Sweden, or but their purpose why they did was to date back. They wanted to see where people originated from and how they migrated throughout the earth. And what they found was that we all came from this region in East Africa, which is exactly what the Bible is saying. And I always find that interesting that they've never been able to prove anything that is contradicting to the Bible. And if you look it up, and I'll try to post pictures of it, you'll see where it like all comes to East Africa, and they even called it Adam and Eve in quotation mark, which is kind of very interesting because National Geographic is not really a religious organization. Key people in Genesis, because it's not just about Garden of Eden, it goes all the way from Adam and Eve, their children, and then Noah's Ark, Abraham, his children. And so it covers a lot of things. But again, starts with the creation of heavens and earth. On the 6th day, he created man. And said, but the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. When you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. And as we know, Eve ate of the fruit. And ever since we've tried to do things our own way, and that's how sin entered the world. So then we go to chapter 6 of Genesis, where it talks about Noah's Ark, where God said, all you people are wicked, they already murder and evil wickedness, and I'm just going to save this one righteous guy and his family and the animals, put them on the Noah's Ark. And that was about 2300 or 2348 BC. So still before the time that Moses lived. But the first thing that Noah and his sons did when they came to the ground, the dry ground, was get naked and drunk. So basically the whole Bible is a book of how God used broken people. And that's good to know that there was no righteous people without a gossip story in the Bible. They all had, they were all broken people that God used. And so then a few chapters later, we have, people living again. And, God promised he was never going to wipe us all out like that again. He gave us a rainbow as a promise. But the people wanted to build this tower so tall that it would reach the sky and put their name on it, basically claim it for their own efforts. And so God saw that and he's like, oh my gosh, you put people together, just going to come up with doing evil and using knowledge to do evil. So he said, let us go down and confuse them. And so that's how people got scattered throughout the whole earth in different languages and different ethnicities, so that we would be focused on not coming together and try to be God, but be dependent on him. Then we have Abraham, and Abraham who was called the father of all nations, or father of many nations. He was a native of Ur, which is near current Iraq. And he was called by God to that he would be a founder of a new nation in an unclaimed land. And he was promised he was going to have all these descendants. Well, his wife Sarah was 90 years old and still hadn't had a kid. So she said, Abraham, why don't you sleep with my maid and have a child through her? And so they had the firstborn, Ishmael. And it is said that Ishmael was the beginning of the Muslim race. Because then later Sarah did get pregnant and had Isaac, and we claim Isaac as the source of the inheritance of God's promises, while the Muslims claim Ishmael. But Sarah got jealous of Hagar, the maid, and Ishmael after she had her own sons, so they sent them off, and that's supposedly how the Muslims took root. And then Isaac and his wife Rebecca had two sons, Jacob and Esau. They were twins, and Esau was the firstborn, and it was very important in those days. That was the birthright. But Jacob, the brother, talked him into selling his birthright to him over soup one day when he was hungry. So Jacob was a conniving man, but later on he wrestled with God and became humble. And Jacob had 12 sons, and God used Jacob, once again, broken people, for his purpose, and named him Israel, and said, out of you will have, the land of Israel, and his 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. And one of his sons was Joseph. Joseph was born about 1746 BC. But the brothers didn't like him, and they tried to sell him as a slave to Egypt. And they didn't tell their father that, well, they told the father that he was dead. So Joseph was a slave in Egypt, but he could interpret dreams. So the Pharaoh found favor with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh made him the prime minister of Egypt. And then Jacob was needing to send his sons to Egypt because there was famine, and they had to go and beg for food. And what the 11 brothers didn't recognize at first was that they were begging for food from the prime minister, which was the brother that they had tried to sell as a slave. And that all led to Joseph being able to be reconciled back to his father and to his brothers, which is what God does. God's a God of reconciliation. And there's a verse in the last chapter, 50, verse 20, that you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring it about as it is this day. So in the Old Testament, God is referred to as Yahweh because that's the word for God in Hebrew. And that's basically a little summary of the key things in Genesis.